being an objective observer that gives no meaning to anything because nothing really came into this world with meaning, right? And so it's like, let's get back to the original, which is just pure being. And in that place, we're clear. Then we can actually channel, or we are at least liberated from our belief that we're limiting us. And so mindfulness, I think, is a great way to enter back into our original self.
Right.
It's a means to an end, not the end.
Welcome to Soul Explorers with your hosts, Gary Langley and Sally Taylor. Welcome to Soul Explorers. Today, Sally and I are very pleased to welcome J Burton. He holds a doctorate in human development counseling. He channels, and we're going to hear more about channeling. We hear a lot about channeling, and there's lots of different forms of channeling. So we'll probably talk about that a little bit as well. But J, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Gary. Glad to be here. Thank you, Sally, for having me as well. And I'm happy and excited to be a guest on your podcast here.
Great.
Oh, we're so glad to have you here. And of course, J, I met you several years ago when we were both living in Colorado.
Yeah.
And I became a big fan of yours even then.
Thank you much.
Because you absolutely helped me through some of my own challenges that I was going through at the time. So
Good.
I know what a good counselor you are.
Thank you.
And of course, I've got one of your books that
right.
You were having. So we'll put your books up here as well so that people know where to find them.
Thanks.
But we're very curious about how you developed into the work that you're currently doing. Do you mind giving us a little bit of the Reader's Digest story of how that all came to be?
I would be glad to. I think of it as being activated. I don't know what else to call that, but 8th grade was when it started. Reading a chapter in the science textbook, and there was a chapter on psychology to describe people's emotions and thoughts and behaviors, and I was absolutely fascinated. I read that chapter 4 or 5 times. I couldn't get enough. So I knew right then, it's like, this is what I need to do. This is what I want to understand. And so it's been from that point forward, and still is, this curiosity-driven desire to understand why we do what we do, what the heck's going on, and how to get sort of choice restored, and how not to be at the effect of either social conditioning, programming, and or trauma, most importantly, because everybody walking the earth has experienced trauma in some forms. And so knew what I wanted to major in school, so got to college and majored in psychology. And freshman year was nice to be away from home, fun to hang out with friends, and what I call experiments in consciousness, to explore thinking and experiencing the world. But studying was not exactly the most important part. So things weren't going well grade-wise. And I was just sitting in my room one day, and to me, this is perhaps my first channeling. I don't quite know, but it was one of the most important ones for me. And I was just sitting there, and this voice of a sort, the kind of voice that you feel perhaps more than you hear, but it just said, you can either dream it or do it. Knowing that I had a dream. And so I was like, okay, thanks. It was time to wake up. So I needed to take action. And from there, being a better quality student from that point on, making Dean's List and all that good stuff. But my curiosity to learn led to getting a master's in clinical psychology, and curiosity to learn and be better at what I'm doing led me to get a doctorate in human development counseling at Vanderbilt. So it was still that pursuit, and a lot of good workshops and good trainings, all with the idea of understanding why we do what we do and how to, again, restore choice and overcome obstacles, clutter, as we might call it. And so in the process of now 42 years of doing this, about 40,000 hours of clinical work has occurred. And so that gives me lots of opportunity to practice getting into a sort of clear state. And in the process of getting into that clear state, different awareness is available. And so that what we can call channeling, or what kind of a mystical experience occurs, where there's a direct communication from spirit that gives information. And so An example is I'm also a Reiki master. And so I was doing some distance Reiki with a client not that long ago. And this particular client was so prone to guilt, so prone to sort of being over responsible for everybody. And in the process of doing the distance Reiki, and we were both silent, but this channeling came in that said, there is nothing to make up for, and there is nothing to prevent. And I just said, we got to stop for a second. I got to tell you what just came to me. And for her, it was a significant pivot point because it covered the past and the future. Nothing to make up for, and there's nothing to prevent. Wow, absolution right there, right? It's like, oh, you're free.
A great lesson for all of us, because I know I have some of those same issues myself around, guilt and responsibility.
Oh, sure. Well,
Right.
with those with a conscience.
I don't do guilt.
He doesn't.
Good for you, man.
He's great that way.
I
It's
used to tell my ex-wife when we were married, I don't do guilt, so don't try. And
that's great. I appreciate that.
I
It's
make mistakes and I try and correct them, but I don't do guilt around it.
I
So
like that a lot. Very healthy bypass of guilt.
I know that at least your early books, I know some of them focused on hypnosis. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
And so do you think that that early background in hypnosis led you to, in a kind of a direct way, towards this other channeling work? How do you see a connection between those, if any?
Yeah, very good question. I would say yes. I've had probably, I don't know, 500 hours worth of training in hypnosis and neuro-linguistic programming, NLP for short. And so to me, that really does help access an altered consciousness. And that's kind of what I do with clients in the process, is help them access an altered consciousness that is cleaner, clearer, wiser, and so that they get access to the truth, as we might call it. And so that's kind of, I think, really been helpful for me, was that training, because to do trance work, I have to go into a trance like any hypnotherapist would tell you. And so I go and they go, and so we kind of tour higher consciousness and find their truth. And so I think it was very helpful. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I don't know that I've heard anybody talk about being in a slightly altered state at the same time they're helping their, their sitter or their client to also achieve that altered state. What does that look like?
Yeah. It's slippery in terms of putting words on it, but it's essential for me to get into that altered or higher consciousness state in order to bring what needs to be applied in the session for the client. So I'm kind of leaving my physical me and going into an altered state in order to get access at kind of a higher level of awareness. So that then I almost think of it as being a bit of an advanced party. So I go out in front and then I sort of help them navigate. And then once they get to a clearing, then they can discover what they need to find.
It reminds me a lot of shamanistic work.
Mm.
In that, you think of the shamanist sort of being the guide into an experience. And so a lot of ways it kind of makes me think of that same similar type of dynamic.
I get you. Yeah, to me, that altered state, and that's partly what has helped me become that more effective at channeling, is because I have to go into that altered state, I get access to more clarity and wisdom, I guess.
There's something that's occurred to me is that, and I mentioned this briefly in the introduction, channeling encompasses a whole lot of aspects. I mean, sometimes I'm clairaudient. Well, that's a form of channeling.
Surely.
And sometimes it's just a sense impression. Sometimes it's a download of information.
Yeah.
That opens up over time. It's like unpacks over time. So I'm starting to understand channeling, because I'm being pushed by Sally to attempt it. I'm starting to understand the dynamics and the multifaceted aspects of channeling. So,
Yep, really good point. I appreciate that, Gary, because it is multifaceted. It can be the audio, it can be, for me, and I know a lot of folks, visual channeling. Many days back when there were offices to work out of and I was driving to work, I would get a visual metaphor on the way to work, and I'd be like, well, what do I do with this? I don't know what to do with this. And then a client would come in later in the day and be like, oh, this is where that goes. And so it was like, for example, the image of a young chick inside the egg, still not quite hatched. But then what's the process of hatching? Well, it starts from the inside out. You can't force that. You can't make that happen. You can't speed it up. It's a process that has a natural evolution to it, but it is done at the individual's initiation. And so it's like, oh, okay, well, that's a lovely metaphor. Let's see who that goes to. And so a client comes in and it's like, hey, you know, it reminds me of the process of a chick hatching. And you're in the process of that, but you're the only one that knows when. And so those facets of visual, auditory, or just that download, as you said, of just information, and sometimes we call it inspiration, sometimes we call it a sudden solution to something. It's like, where'd that come from? Well,
Well, and that leads me to the question, what do you understand as the source of the information that comes to you?
yeah, good question. For me, it's oneness. I don't know what else to call it. The original kind of infinite, eternal oneness that knows everything. I get a lot of information in my dreams as well. That was kind of the basis for that one book, The Sacred Sequence, Remembering the One Truth, based on a dream. And one of the other dreams I had one night, among many that I'm grateful for, was I was in a doctor's office trying to tell the doctor some information, and I couldn't quite find the right words. And there was this off camera, so to speak, voice. And I was like, do you remember everything I was saying to this being of a sort? And he said, yes, we do. And it was like it was ranking from 1 to 5, 1 not very important, 5 really important. It said, we remember everything, even if it's a number 2. And I thought, you know, there's a metaphor in there. Even if it's a number 2, even if it's crap, they remember it.
I was thinking the same thing. That's so
Exactly. It's like, okay, so then you do. Thank you. And so it is that oneness place where everything is.
so
Very good.
higher beings or your higher self is,
Yep.
you know,
Exactly. Some connection, communion with the one that knows all, that is all.
dare we say the word God?
I think so, you know,
Yeah.
many words, including no words, but yes,
Yeah, and somebody else described it recently as the I am that I am.
yes, beautiful. Yep, that is the great I
So
am.
tell us a little bit about the content of some of this information that has become book form for
Sure.
you.
So
Uh,
if we do the sacred sequence, remembering the one truth, it started as a dream where, well, it was actually a trilogy. And the first part of the dream was I was standing in an old home with a really large bay window with another person, and this other person was a known skeptic. You couldn't tell him anything, they would doubt everything. And it was dusk. And so outside, we could also see that there was a war going on. You could see cannon shells being exchanged back and forth. There was a civil war. It wasn't just any war, it was a civil war. And so we were standing there, and I knew I couldn't tell this other person, this is a dream, this isn't really happening. They would never believe me. So all of a sudden, the ammunition dump blows up for the rebels. It's like, well, they've got nothing to work with, so the war's over. And immediately that shifted to the next scene where I'm in a sort of cafe, outdoor cafe, and I'm sitting there at a table, and this woman comes through the table next to me, puts down a briefcase and says, I don't know if you'll write it. And that was the second part. It was done, over. Third part, I'm in this huge factory. I couldn't even see the end of it. There's all kinds of working parts in there. And there's this little character that looks exactly like the wizard from The Wizard of Oz. And so he was showing me around, and I said, this is incredible. It's amazing. He said, that's just a little something I put together. I was like, you kidding me? A little something you put together. And he said, yep. And he said, you know, there's no such thing as wrong. Like the number 4 is never wrong. Sometimes it's misused, but it's never wrong. And then you can take 4 times 4. And I said, what's that for? And he said, 16s. I said, what do you mean? He said, you can take faith, hope, love, and charity and apply it to God, self, others, and the universe. And it was just clear as day. That's what I heard. And it's like faith, hope, love, charity, apply to God, self, others, and the universe. Wow. I said, wow, I got to think on that. And then the picture started fading. And I said, I don't want to leave. He said, you can come back anytime. And then it was gone. And so it took me about 10 years to decipher all that he was trying to tell me. and
that's a lot of metaphor.
oh boy. And then working with clients to also understand, okay, there's this place, the one truth, which is kind of where he was showing me that there is an isness there. And so the Civil War is the war we have in our head. that critical voice that goes on and we're fighting back and forth. That's not true. Yes, you are. You stink. No, no, I'm okay. And so back and forth. And then there's that little sort of invitation and almost a dare. I don't know if you write it. And then there was the Wizard of Oz telling us we already have everything we need. We just have to access it.
One thing I'd like to add, I think we all channel, everybody,
I would agree.
on varying levels,
I would agree.
because we all get inspiration that
Yes.
did come from our base of knowledge. And I think it's an ability, because we become so materialistic, that's atrophied in the human
Uh-huh.
species.
Makes perfect sense. I think so. It's the priorities have shifted, the focus has shifted away.
But I think it may be coming back.
I hope so.
You know, it seems to be there. It just seemed to be so many people channeling now, coming out of the closet with it. You know, and because it's a more comfortable atmosphere for it now. And yeah, which brings me to my next question that I often give to our guests. Do you feel we're going through a big transformation right now in consciousness on the planet?
Yes, absolutely. And part of the way we know, I think, to me, is as transition occurs, people who are not as secure within try to grab and hold on to something that will let them feel more secure. So we have certain groups and factions that get developed that are kind of rigid and conservative, and that's their way of trying to hold on to something because they get a little overwhelmed by the transition into a more abstract kind of way of being. And so I think that's one of the pieces of evidence, so to speak, of the transition going on, the dichotomy that's happening.
I think the dichotomy is also between love and fear.
Yes, sir.
There are the people that are still rooted in fear, and of course, fear begets more fear.
Absolutely. It finds what it's looking for, right?
Right.
And it
Right.
bends everything to support its belief.
That's it.
Mhm.
And then on the other hand, we have shows like this where people are actively looking for information about spiritual experience, about what feels like information that is coming to them, inspiration, and how to understand it better and
Yes.
understand their role in the world. So I
Mhm.
think you do have definitely both sides of that coin, the fear, but then the actual active interest and curiosity and search for
Yes.
these kinds of programs, right?
Yes. I love that search, the independent curiosity that leads the search, because that's how we're going to get independent. That's how we're going to help humanity evolve.
Right. So that said, I know, of course, you work a lot with individuals and individual counseling,
Mhm.
but how do you assist people in coming to that sort of recognition of their connection with the oneness, the wholeness, that more healthy state of being?
Yeah.
How does that work in your process?
So I guess the first step is really trying to find out what the person wants to accomplish and how they want to feel and be and live. And then we look at the things that are in the way, whether it's past experiences, but most importantly, it's the beliefs they form as a result of an experience. The experience has no meaning attached to it. It just, we may not like it, but it's got no meaning. It's the meaning or the belief we form that has the power. And so we can recognize that we have an opportunity to change the belief, but the belief will automatically change when we raise our consciousness because every belief stems from a particular level of consciousness. And there is that place in consciousness that is literally beyond belief, where beliefs do not exist.
What would you say, John, is the best way to raise your consciousness?
Well, great question. Lots of good ways. One is mindfulness, being an objective observer that gives no meaning to anything because nothing really came into this world with meaning, right? And so it's like, let's get back to the original, which is just pure being. And in that place, we're clear. Then we can actually channel, or we are at least liberated from our beliefs that were limiting us.
Hmm.
And so mindfulness, I think, is a great way to enter back into our original self.
Right.
It's a means to an end, not the end.
And to be in present moment awareness.
Exactly, to just be pure
Because
presence.
most people live in the future and the past.
Oh yeah, Yep. And interestingly, it's impossible to do anxiety if we are living in the present. It requires us to leave the present and go into an imaginary future for anxiety to occur. So it's almost like anxiety is feedback about our time orientation.
Mhm. Do you feel fear is, and when I say fear, I really like to differentiate this because there is the survival fear. If there's a truck bearing down on me, my body's going to react. I'm going to jump out of the way. My heart's going to race. That's one kind of fear. But then there's the psychological fear. Psychological fear is, oh, what if this happens? What if that
Yep.
happens?
Yep.
And I think we need to differentiate the two. When you say you can live fearlessly,
Mhm.
it means without the psychological fear.
Beautiful. Yep. Very accurate, very true, and very important to differentiate. Absolutely.
I think
Being
so.
free of fear means we're fully present, fully in the moment. We are not leaving that to imagine stuff because, for the most part, the only part of us that wants to imagine the future, very often anyway, is the fear brain.
Hmm.
And so it's like, well, it's going to be biased from the get-go. It's not going to imagine good things. It's going to look at catastrophes. So it's like, oh crap, I don't want to watch that horror movie. And so being in the present allows us to be not just fearless, as you say, but also, as you've also described, creative. We can then actually co-create with the infinite energy the future that we wish by being in the present. We get access.
And I underlined a spot in the book that I have, The Sacred Sequence, where you said something to the effect of, it's not the trauma, it's your response to the trauma.
Yep, trauma is a response, just like allergies are a response, right? Ragweed doesn't necessarily create the same response in everybody. Some people get sneezy and runny nose, watery eyes, and some people are like ragweed, smagweed. So it's the response that makes all the difference. So part of what I work with others is recognizing the power that's available by chosen response. We could almost think of every event as being like stem cells. Stem cells are not dedicated to becoming anything. They can become whatever you want them to be. And if we get sort of in touch with the power of our response options, we can then create the reality or activate the reality that we desire.
With that said, someone who has had sort of an experience that they have designated as traumatic,
Mhm.
and they've, you know, eh, they're struggling with the after effects of that. How would you recommend to them that they then reassess their response to the event
Mhm.
that they accept as having been traumatic, so that it somehow is altered into something more positive for them?
Beautiful. Yeah. One, I think, is the probably most potent influence in trauma is that we've personalized something. We took it personally. And as soon as we do that, it activates all the other kind of irrational thoughts and beliefs. So we can find a way to not personalize it, even though, yes, it happened to us. We are a witness to it. We recognize that that person who is the offender probably treats other people poorly as well. So if we look more at the offender, we can see that, oh, well, that wasn't about me. They're just a nasty person. They are just disrespectful or whatever we might want to call that kind of behavior. So it's like, oh, I see. It wasn't about me. It was about them. And that changes the focus and gets it off self. That's kind of one of the ways I think is getting the personalizing piece out of there. And then the other is literally raising consciousness, whether it's through mindfulness or some methods, one called meta stating, which Michael Hall developed, which is just using the naturally existing layers of consciousness in us to climb up above. And when you get to a certain level, personalizing stops because it's just not part of that consciousness. And by accessing that, it falls away, it demagnetizes the belief in a way.
Perspective really is everything.
Very much. Yep, yep. It really frames everything and gives things meaning or takes meaning away. So that's one of the ways of really kind of altering the effect of trauma. And it's pretty much what my work involves is one form of trauma or another. It doesn't have to be major life-changing trauma, but it influences not just our beliefs, but what we consider acceptable or allowable behaviors and choices so that we give ourselves freedom.
Since we started this conversation out with channeling,
Mhm.
if someone is interested in beginning to experience channeling
Mhm.
for themselves. And it could be in very minor, personal ways. I know you've talked about mindfulness. What
Mhm.
other steps beyond that might they approach this work with if they're interested in?
Yeah, I think it's almost counterintuitive in the sense of, okay, I want to channel, but if I want to channel, I'm going to try, I'm going to reach, I'm going to sort of do something instead of doing nothing. And so, as you guys both know, since you both channel, it's the doing nothing or the pure being state to whatever degree we can that makes space for that stuff to come in. So it's like, all right, I don't want to have an agenda. I don't want to have a need. I want to just get to whatever state of being, effortless being that I can. And then whatever it is that becomes into the awareness is most useful, is most fitting and appropriate. So we don't really have an agenda or a need. It's just trying to get clear. And mindfulness is one way. Breath work is another great way, I think, of getting clear. Lately, I've been playing with the idea of focusing on the exhale. At the end of our natural exhale, there's still a little bit of carbon dioxide left. And if we push it out, you can even feel your abs kind of tighten a little bit. There's a clearing that happens. And then the inhale, and it's like, oh, something just left me. I don't know what. And so doing that for a little bit of time, a minute or two or more if you want, can help create a clearing so that we've released attachments to beliefs and needs and conditioning and all that stuff. We've made a space. Sometimes a really good hobby where you lose yourself in the process, whether it's gardening or woodworking or you name it, is another great way of allowing channeling because we've preoccupied our conscious human self and enjoying it at the same time because it's a fun hobby. And then stuff comes in.
Yeah, because you're in
Right.
the zone. You're in
Yes,
that.
sir.
The flow state.
Yep, exactly.
Exactly. Well, that's fantastic. So let me ask you this then. This is another question that I've had around talking to people about my experiences with accessing information. And I do use the word dissociation,
Okay.
which I know in psychology is often thought of as a negative thing, right? But
Yeah.
I use it in sort of for me, it's positive aspect of shifting myself aside so that there's room for that information to flow. And so it's a proactive
Yes.
activity as opposed to an escape, which
Absolutely.
is
Great
the more
differentiation.
pathological.
Yep. Yep. Great differentiation. I'd say that's
Okay.
absolutely the process.
Okay. So you do experience it somewhat similarly
Oh,
then.
yes. Mm-hmm.
So when I have talked in about this process with people recently, and you basically said it yourself, John, that focus is actually the sweet spot. It's
Mm-hmm.
not thinking, it's not getting all thoughts out of your head. It's just placing your attention on a point of focus.
Yes. Yes.
And that focus then actually allows. So when people talk about the flow state of making art or writing or whatever, and I always think of that as collaborative in nature anyway.
Yes. Yes.
It's those moments when you lose time
Exactly.
and suddenly an hour has gone by and you thought it was 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh,
It's a beautiful sort of trademark of being in a lovely altered state.
so tell us a little more about the work that you're currently
Excuse me.
doing and where that's taking you.
Sure. So been doing a pretty good bit of reading and learning about, I guess, Eastern mysticism. I don't know why we geographically differentiate, but nonetheless, because mysticism is kind of the same no matter where you are. But looking into just better clearing of myself to get more into the I am. And another one of my favorite writers who's not Eastern, but Neville Goddard, who talks about the power of imagination and the ability to co-create, as you say earlier, is one of my favorite folks about how to connect with the energy of spirit, source, God, and bring that into our lives through us into manifesting. And I've really appreciated his work and his perspectives and the metaphorical descriptions he uses. So I've really enjoyed his work. And then Sadhguru, I've really enjoyed reading his work. Was his particular book that I read that stood out for me was a Yogi's Guide to Crafting Your Destiny. Very good stuff. And so kind of focusing on more again on mysticism, but ways to kind of find openings, portals, by doing some reading and studying, so that it, again, the more I can clear out my own conditioning or beliefs or programming, the more I'm able to get clear and be effective as a resource for others to get themselves clear and clean. So that's been greatly my focus, and it's been working with, again, mostly people peeling away the layers that are illusion, getting to their true original self, their true heart, you might say, and different ways to do it. And it's kind of an ongoing, for me, just an ongoing learning process. Maybe I share obviously a lot with clients and help them learn things, but they teach me just as much because their experience helps me understand what's going on and how come and what works and what doesn't, and tweaking and such. So it's a learning process. And I've done a lot of workshops that were more intense, like 1 and 2 day workshops that I really enjoy doing for people to kind of immerse into that consciousness work, so that they come away with more ability to choose their consciousness and manage their consciousness, and thus have more emotional independence instead of conditional emotions. And so I think that's been a lot of the focus these days.
I think
Go
there's
ahead.
no end to the learning. You
No,
know,
there is no end. Exactly. There is no end.
there is no, well, I've arrived. Now you would have no purpose at that point.
Yes, I think I would cease to exist as a human, I guess. I don't know. But there have been maybe some beings that have come to this earth that did complete, maybe,
Oh, sure.
and showed us how, and lovely ways. But yeah, I don't find that there's an end, because, well, certainly as a human, I can't get there, but there isn't an end anyway.
Right.
So what do you, so this is a question that I used to ask frequently, but since you've brought up the idea that there is no end, what do you feel occurs after we leave the physical body?
Uh, I think there's some kind of a transitional phase in some way, wherever I'm reoriented, I think would be a good way to describe it. But we don't dissolve, we just lose physical shape, physical form, and then we are in that oneness. And it's like I get the image of, speaking of visual channeling, the image of how many water molecules are there in the waters of this earth? Trillions of trillions of trillions of trillions, but each one occupies a single space. And yet collectively, it is all the oceans and seas and waters above and below ground. And I think of us as being one of the water molecules of the collective. And so we're part of the whole, inseparable, and yet distinct.
And how do you understand then our sense of disconnection
Mm,
in the physical?
yeah, great question. This thing called human ego, the small self, as some call it, it believes only in the tangible, and it only can focus outside of self. It can't do internal reflection. So it's already stuck in an illusion because it can't understand the whole picture. So it creates a sense of item by item by item by item, like going into a grocery store or something, and there's 28 cans of beans, and yet all beans are part of the vegetables, and all vegetables are part. And so it can't really differentiate. So it's stuck with believing that there is such a thing as separation, and it doesn't have the capacity to go otherwise or to know otherwise. So one of the other things, speaking of working on things lately, understanding more about the human ego, because often it's kind of considered the enemy. And I think it's more of a misunderstanding of the ego than it is it being an enemy. If we recognize the intent of the ego, which is devotion, dedication, protection, that's a form of love. We go, well, what, huh? Why are you calling me a moron or something here? How is that love? No, it's the intent, because underneath that, we have to translate the ego. If we take it literally, we're stuck as much as it is. And so its attempt is to get us to change. Its attempt is to help us do better, or to not be hurt. Oddly enough, it says, oh, if you talk to these people and you've never met them before, they're not going to like you. Well, that's just trying to keep me from getting hurt, feeling rejected. It's like, that's kind, but I'm okay. And so if we can recognize the intent of ego, we can actually give gratitude. if we say thank you for its intention, not for the way it manifests, but for its intention, it's really remarkable what happens to the energy and the relationship with ego.
I think ego has an actual important function in the human experience.
No.
It's just gotten out of control.
Yep. When we buy into it too much in its literal form, man, then we have a war.
An internal war. Yeah.
Yep, internal and external, right? Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And so if we can recognize its intent, which is devotion, dedication, and protection, well, that's a form of love. And we just give thanks to the intent, and it changes the flavor, the energy, and the relationship. So it diffuses it.
No, I think that's good. And I agree. I think obviously we came into these physical bodies for some experience and
Yeah.
ego is a piece of that experience.
Mhm.
And so it must have some practical use
Yeah,
as well.
exactly. It's when it gets to that self-critical piece that it's kind of painful. Or the
Right.
paranoid piece where it's really uncomfortable and makes us do things we don't really need to do. So it's understanding the ego instead of, judging the judge.
So John, tell us where people can find you
Sure.
and your books as well. If you don't mind, tell us a few of the titles of your books in addition to The Sacred Sequence.
Yeah,
And
thank
I
you.
will make sure people have those links.
Cool. Website is drjohnjburton.com. Facebook is drjohnjburton.com. Keep things simple. And then email, if they wish to contact me, is johnjburton@bellsouth.net. johnjburton@bellsouth.net. Anybody wants to contact, or they can do it through my website as well. One of the first books I wrote was called States of Equilibrium, which is kind of a, I don't know, personality theory of a sort, and a description of dynamics and how to change responses. And then two of the other books were on hypnotic language, sort of the use of it, the structure of it, the dynamics of it, which I think anybody can read in the sense that it really goes into meaning making and how do we try to make meaning of things and how we can change meaning for things that we have observed or experienced. So it's available in the sense of it can be applicable to anybody, not just somebody who wants to learn how to do hypnotic language. And then the most recent one is, what's the title again? I gotta remember that title.
The Sacred Sequence, that one or a
The
different
one
one?
that came after that, sort of built
Oh,
upon
after.
the sacred sequence, A Conspiracy of Love, Revealing the Heart of the Universe.
Good.
It's
That
in
one I still need to get.
it's in the Kindle form
Okay.
on
Okay. So
Amazon.
it can be found on Amazon.
Yep,
Okay, very
yep.
good. I will make sure we have links to all of those. So
Cool.
tell me just a little bit about this last one because it's the one that I haven't gotten my hands on yet.
Cool.
What does it cover?
It's one of the sort of pieces in there is this concept of transnoia, which is the idea that everything doesn't just have God in it or is a particle or an element of God, but it's all here designed to help us in our spiritual evolution. Every person, every event, everything has a purpose and a function to help us evolve spiritually. And so from that perspective, we review ego, we review emotions like depression, anxiety, anger, guilt, and recognize kind of translating and finding the embedded opportunity in there for the spiritual growth to return to oneness. And so it's kind of a journey into back to oneness.
Which we all need to be reminded
Oh
of on a
man,
regular
yeah,
basis.
daily,
Yeah.
sometimes a lot of times a day.
Right, right. Well, thank you, John, for coming to visit us today. We really appreciate your
Oh, thank you
time
for having
and
me.
your
It's great to be here.
wisdom. And I look forward to more work coming through you, I'll
Yeah,
say, because I find that seems to be the way it happens, doesn't it?
yeah, it does. It's a lovely process, very enjoyable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
John, it was
Well,
a real pleasure meeting you today. And maybe
Thank you.
you'll come back sometime and talk with us further. We can
I would love to, absolutely love to. And thank you.
collaborate.
Very nice to meet you, Gary, as well. A real pleasure. And Sally, thank you again for having me on. I appreciate this, and I appreciate what you guys do for the assistance of others to be able to find their spirit within and to be able to cultivate that and develop it.
That's our goal.
thank you.
Valuable,
Yes.
valuable.
All right. Well,
All
thank you.
right. Well, till next time.
Okay, you all take good care and have a wonderful 2025.
If you enjoyed this content, please hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications.